Okay.
Today at the Rock House, I'm really honoured to have Brian Forsythe from Kicks and Rhino Bucket here with us today. Brian has seen the highs and the absolute lows of the rock and roll industry. Brian, how are things today, mate?
Good so far.
Yeah? Where are you based these days? Are you still in LA?
No, actually, I'm in Nashville.
Nashville. That seems to be the
Yeah.
home of rock and roll these days.
Yeah, I was in LA for like 26 years,
Yeah.
and I just eventually had to bail. It was so expensive out there.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Mate, if my research is correct, you had aspirations at an early age of becoming a garbage man. Is that right?
Yeah, that was my first career choice when I
Yeah.
was like five-ish, like 4 and 5, because I used to watch the Garbage Men, and they looked like they were having fun, and I wanted a job where I would have fun, you
Yeah.
know?
So what changed that career direction? What happened?
Well, right around that age, 5, like the end of, like, what was it, February? Uh, I turned 6 that following September. So I was still 5 when I saw the Beatles on Edd Sullivan.
Mate.
And yeah, of course that changed everything. I mean, before that, I was, my parents were big music listeners. So I was a fan of music. But when I saw the Beatles, that was a whole nother thing. And it was like, wow, that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
That looked even more fun than being a garbage man.
I'm sure it did. Mate, that Edd Sullivan show changed the lives of so many musicians. It must have been, just an absolute amazing event to watch. And
Yeah. Well, because it was like before that it was just like 50s stuff. And it was just a complete, like and this is before internet or anything, so you're not connected to the world. So over there they were probably more used to it, but in America we had Elvis and that kind of thing, Elvis and Johnny Cash. And so uh yeah, when the Beatles came, their whole look, their sound, everything was just completely different. It was like, bam, like, what is this?
So you've seen the Beatles. What then made you to pick up a guitar? What drew you to the guitar?
That the Beatles. I mean, I saw that. So I have 2 brothers.
Yeah.
So we used to we'd pretend we were the Beatles. And I'm left-handed. So back then, my natural way to pick a guitar up was upside down. So I didn't realize Paul McCartney was actually the bass player. I just thought he was another guitar player that was holding his guitar left-handed. So I thought, okay, I'll be Paul McCartney. And I made my brother, whose name is John, he was John Lennon, so it was just this natural thing. And we would just lip sync to the record.
That's awesome. So you started picking up the guitar. Were there any other, outside of the Beatles, were there any other inspirations that you tried to emulate?
Maybe a little further on, but my grandfather played guitar. So I was fascinated by it. Like, we'd go to visit and he'd pull the guitar out and he'd start playing. He was like he played folk songs and stuff. And in fact, I have his guitar. It's like a 1937 Gibson.
Oh, wow.
And so he would pull that thing out, and he'd only pull it out when we come to visit. So it sat in his closet. So it's in mint condition. And so I remember soon after the Beatles, both me and my brother we wanted guitars for Christmas. And we were still kids. So my parents, they weren't going to buy us real guitars. So they bought us these cheap like Masonite, like cardboard, these hootenanny guitars. They're like guitars, but they said hootenanny on them. They had pictures of cowboys and stuff. So we got these guitars, and I remember taking them to my grandfather's house and asking him to tune the guitar for me. But it was it was a toy, so he couldn't tune. He spent like all this time trying to tune it, and then he'd play a chord and it would just be like, oh, this isn't working.
I think I had one of those myself. Yeah. turned me off my musical career, let me tell you.
But when we spent hours just banging away on those things, just pretending. So, it was still fun.
Yeah. So when did you get the first real guitar?
That was probably for my 9th or 10th birthday. I get the years mixed up now. The older I get, the foggier my memory
Uh,
gets. But
Let me tell you, it gets worse.
but I remember because of those hootenanny guitars, we used to abuse them. We'd scoot around on them like they were a motorcycle, or we do all kinds of stuff with those things. So when I asked for a real guitar, my parents were still a little bit leery. They were like, "Is this going to end up out in the yard?" And I convinced them. I said, "No, I really want to learn how to play." And by that point, I have a brother that's 4 years older, and he was already starting to play. Like, he had an acoustic guitar, and he had already shown me a few chords. So
Nice.
so I finally got this guitar for my birthday, and it was a cheap guitar, but still, it was enough to learn on. And man, I was obsessed with it. And I hardly ever put it down. I was always playing it. So and my brother had all these like Beatles songbooks. He had Bob Dylan songbooks, and they had the little chord charts at the top of the page, so that's how I learned all my chords. And especially with the Bob Dylan songs. So I learned all my chord changes from playing Bob Dylan songs.
Wow, Bob Dylan, there's another famous name in
Yeah.
music history. So you started learning the guitar. When was your first foray into playing in an actual band?
That wasn't until junior high, but I remember trying like earlier on with friends. But I'd have these friends, but they weren't musicians, and I'd say, "Why don't you get a guitar and learn how to play it?" It's like, I thought it was easy, for somebody just to go, that wasn't really a musician, to just be a musician. I didn't realize, it took a kind of a special talent. So that it never came to be. But we used to draw cartoons of what the band would look like. We'd come up with names, and so I did a lot of that early on. And then finally in junior high, I started meeting other musicians. I had a few different incarnations of bands through that period. And looking back at it, I mean, we must have been horrendous. Because we're just starting out. You're just terrible, but you don't care because it's fun to play, and you
Yeah,
just keep doing it.
yeah.
But here's the funny thing: my very first band, there was a point when I started getting serious with guitar, where I was also interested in drums, and
Okay.
I ended up talking my mother into getting me a drum set at some point. So my first band, I started out as the drummer.
Is that right?
And yeah,
Yeah.
so, but I wasn't, I was okay. I could get by on the drums, and we had another guitar player that could also play drums. So we would switch off.
Oh,
And
wow.
at one point, I just started getting better on guitar than him, and better on guitar than I was on drums, obviously. It was obvious. So we ended up just getting another drummer, and then we had two guitars after that. So
Awesome. Do you still play the drums occasionally,
a
Brian?
little bit. I have my girlfriend's in there laughing. I, I bought a
She's
set
on
of
the drums.
drums.
Heard you on the drums, right?
Yeah, but I hadn't had a set of drums in years. So like a couple of years ago, I bought a set, just a small little jazz set, because I love little compact, small bass drum, and it's just a snare tom and floor tom. So I have one set up down there, and every once in a while I get on there and just play around. But it's not the same unless you're playing with somebody. And I don't really have anyone to play with at the moment. And I'm way out of practice too. It's kind of embarrassing.
Mate, if I ever make my way to Nashville, I'll pack my bass guitar and I'll come and do a session with you. My
Yeah.
bass skills probably replicate your drum skills, I'd say. So it's going to be interesting. Anyway, moving on. So in high school, it was around this time that you met up with another musician by the name of Ronnie Youngkins. Is that right?
Well, yeah, kind of. He was in a different high school, so we didn't go to school together, but I used to see his band around, and I became friends with him. I'd go out to see his band play. And it was weird because before I even got into an established band, I think I'd seen him in 3 different bands that he had, that I saw him in one and then another. And then I was in this one band, and our bass player was sort of funding the band. So he owned the PA. And Ronnie's band used to rent his PA from him.
Yeah.
So I would go along with him to gigs because he'd run the sound for Ronnie's band.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I got to know Ronnie.
Yeah. At some stage, you and Ronnie really had a meeting of minds and decided to form a band together with Donnie Purnell as well. How did that meeting happen?
Oh yeah, that was later on down the road, but yeah, the thing with Ronnie, when I first saw Ronnie, he was like he was already a rock star back then.
Yeah.
You know, you don't see guys like in high school that have like the cool, maybe now, but back then, this was like
Yeah.
70s, and he had this cool shag haircut, and he just looked like this rock star guy up there. So
Nice.
I remember I was fascinated with that. And at one point he was in like this, and then later on he was in this well-established cover band around the area, and he was leaving that band and they were holding auditions. And I remember I tried out for the band.
Okay.
I was going to take his spot. And then that's around the time when I ran into him. I stopped in at the 7-Eleven late at night. In fact, it's weird how everything's interconnected. I was between bands, and I was running lights for Jimmy's band. He was in this band called Atlas Ram, and I was their light guy because I just wanted to be around music. So I used to run lights for them. So it was after one of their gigs, I was on my way home and I stopped in to get something to eat at this 7-Eleven. And I was back by the microwave heating a burrito. And out of the corner of my eye, I see Ronnie, and he comes walking up and he goes, "Hey, what's going on?" He asked me what I was up to, and I told him I was trying out for his band. And he was like, he did everything he could to talk me out of that. He goes, "Oh man, you don't want to play with those guys." He goes, "They're never going to go anywhere. They never rehearse. They've been playing the same songs for years." And then that's when he tried to sell me on the Donnie Purnell project. And I listened to him, and I remember thinking, this thing he was doing with Donnie was just starting from scratch. Like they weren't established. I knew Donnie had played around in some well-known bands, but I remember going home after that thinking, God, do I want to play, do I want to start over from scratch, or do I want to jump into a band that's already working? So I was kind of torn between those two. And luckily the next day, the drummer at the time, our original drummer, his name was Donnie Spence, he called me and he talked my ear off for like an hour. And he finally convinced me. He goes, "Well, why don't you just try it? Just see what you think." And I was still living at home at this point. So they didn't have any, they were like everybody, we were all like, well, I was at home, so I was being taken care of, but they were all starving. They were scrounging change to get something to eat. And so they didn't have a place to rehearse. So I invited them over to my parents' basement to rehearse. And so they all show up that weekend, and we go down into the basement, set up, and the first song that Donnie showed us was Atomic Bombs from the first record.
Wow.
That was the first song we played together. And he sang it because we didn't have a singer yet. So I remember thinking, wow, this is, for an original song, this is really cool. Because, back in those days, you'd go see a band, and most bands, to get gigs, you have to play cover songs. So you'd see a band playing all these cover songs, and then they'd announce their original, and it'd always be like the worst song of the night. They'd play some original, like, oh man.
Everyone just stands there going, "Oh, okay, yep."
Yeah. So to actually play an original that was cool was like it was like, man, this is like, I didn't know it was possible. So they sold me on it. So from that point on, I was in the band.
Yeah, you're right. Look, it was a big risk. The music industry back in those days was built on bands playing covers, right? So to, take that leap of faith, it actually works. You, Ronnie, and Donnie then formed the Shoes. Is that right?
Yeah, that was our first name, spelled
Yeah,
Shooze.
yeah.
And we went through a few singers before we found Steve, but we started playing out right away. And um yeah, we did covers. I mean, we did 3 sets a night. That was like the standard thing for a band at that point. So we do 3 sets a night, and we just intermingle like a couple originals here
Well,
and there. And yeah, and as we went, Donnie was just constantly writing songs. So, and they were all rough at the, really rough form in the early days. And we'd play them live and then kind of work things out. We go back to rehearsal and we go, well, that didn't work, so let's try this. And
yeah.
it just, over time, they got better and better. And then we went through, there was one singer that never made it out of the basement. We rehearsed with him up until like a little bit before the first gig. And then we got, the second singer was this guy named Terry Brady, who Donnie played with previously in a band. Really good front man, good singer. But the problem was he was married. Like, after Donnie's previous band broke up, this guy got married, and his wife didn't want him going back to being in a band. So he offered to sort of get us started. And it was only temporary. So he got us through the first, maybe not quite a year, but a good chunk of the first year of gigs. And then we got a third guy who was also a really good singer, but just kind of awkward on stage, this tall, gawky kind of guy. And I don't know what happened with that guy. He started having, well, the final nail in the coffin for him was he called in sick one night and was like, what? You can't call in sick for rock and roll.
No,
So,
absolutely not.
and it was one of those fake calls where Donnie was describing it. He called Donnie to tell him, and he goes, Donnie, and he had like this fake cough. I'm gonna be good tonight. I have a sore throat. So we had to just wing it and play it without him. And from that point on, it was like, we got to find a real singer, like,
Yeah.
and that's when Steve came along. And I remember driving up to West Virginia to this little tiny dump of a club. And Steve was the drummer singer of this band. And we go in there, and there's maybe 15 to 20 people in this place. And it's just the diviest bar you could imagine. And there's Steve's band up there playing, and they're playing Zeppelin. And Steve's singing Led Zeppelin from behind the drums. So on his break, we take him out to the car and we played him our demo. And he was like starstruck when he saw us. Because to him, like the way I described Ronnie when I first saw him on stage,
Yeah.
it's kind of the way that Steve saw, like when we came into the club, we had this rock star persona about us, even though we didn't really back then. But to him, he's from this tiny little town in West Virginia. So, we're from the big city, like Hagerstown, Maryland. and we show up, and it's me, Ronnie, and Donnie. And so we convinced him to come down and try out for us.
It's
And
awesome.
and it was it's funny though, he wasn't the front man that he is now right off the bat. It took him a while to figure it out. So I remember his first gig, he didn't know what to do. He was standing there with just like deer in the headlights, just singing. And we just played relentlessly back then. So eventually, after gig after gig after gig, and we play. There's this one club where we'd have the residency, so we play a whole week. It's like 6 nights, and it would be five sets a night. for 6 nights, and the club owner made us go on time for every single set. Like we couldn't be late. We couldn't, even if there's nobody there. So you'd be there on a Tuesday night and there'd be nobody there except one
Yeah.
guy at the bar or something. And we still have to play. So that's when Steve like learned how to be a front man, because we just started goofing around because, you know, we just have fun with it and we'd play, and and Steve's a funny guy anyway. So he just started joking around and making fun of the guy at the bar, you know, just all this stuff. And he finally realized, oh, you know, I should just do this on stage. And that became his kind of his persona, you know.
So you're playing 5 sets a night. Are you putting more originals into those sets at this point?
Yeah.
Steve's on board? Yeah.
Yeah, well, 5 sets, we could put a bunch of them in there, but the standard 3 sets, we got it down to where we do a whole set of originals. So we do one set of, almost got down to one set of AC/DC, one set of Led Zeppelin, and then an original set. But even with the AC/DC and the Led Zeppelin, we'd throw a couple other things around it too, but it was
nice.
Like that was the meat of each set.
It must have been an amazing time, and thinking of Steve's voice, it would actually lend itself well to Led Zeppelin covers as well. So it must have been. At this stage, Atlantic Records come knocking on the door. What happened there?
Yeah, that was interesting because I mean, that was the whole goal from the beginning. I mean, that was Donnie's thing. He wanted to write originals and get a record deal. And you know, up until that point, I just was having fun in bands. I never even like thought that far ahead. So you know, we started doing the demos, and none of us had any experience on how to get a record deal. So the way we did it was, there was another band in Baltimore that did have a record deal. They were signed to Capitol, and we used to open for them all the time. They were like the big band in Baltimore. And so we went after their manager, because their manager got them the deal. So we went and asked him if he'd manage us.
Nice.
And he ultimately got us our deal. And the way he did it, this is funny too, because we had the proper demos and all that stuff, but our manager used to take, we had a cassette deck in the console, sound console, and every gig he would stick a cassette in there and we'd record live. And he would take those cassettes and he put them in an envelope and just send it off to all the different record companies. So we got signed from a live tape, board tape, which is crazy.
Nice. So Atlantic Records come knocking on the door, and at this point you also changed the name from the Shoes to Kicks. Why was that name changed there?
Actually, we couldn't use the Shoes because there was another band in the Midwest called Shoes, even though it was spelled SHOES.
Okay.
But they had songs on the radio, so we knew we couldn't use that name.
Okay.
So we actually changed it to the Generators first. So we got signed as the Generators. And in fact, see that the first album cover.
Yep.
That whole design was around I have a picture of it downstairs with the logo of the Generators on it.
Oh, wow.
Because that's what it was going to be. It was all about electricity and all that stuff. And the day that they had to submit the artwork, they just out of to play it safe, they ran the name and found out that Generators was already used.
Oh no. And
I remember Atlantic, even they called up that band's manager. They offered them a deal with Atlantic to put out a single if they would sell us the name, and they didn't want to. So it was like, okay, they said, they came to us like in a panic, the guy from the art department, and he goes, you got to come up with another name. He goes, if we don't get this artwork in by 5 o'clock, it's going to mess up the whole release date of the record. So we had to come up with something on the spot. So we're all like looking at each other, and Donnie goes, how about if we call it Kicks, and we'll spell it KIX? and it's weird because we all kind of went, just looked at each other. We're like, okay, I guess. None of us had a better idea, but it wasn't like the best name, but we just had to go with it. So that's
Yeah,
what happened.
yeah. No, well, it worked well. In 1981, the debut album Kicks was released. That must have been an amazing time for a young and upcoming band to have not only their first record deal but their first album out.
Yeah, it was well, it was good and it was bad in the way that like the end of the 70s, they cracked down on the whole payola thing with the record labels and so when we got our deal, they weren't giving out advances at that point. Like all the money thing had been shut down. So we basically we got nothing on signing. I mean, they fronted us the money to record. So we missed out on that because later on, like in the 80s, I'd be talking to like Tracy Guns or somebody from LA Guns, and he had this brand new Corvette, and he'd go, "Yeah, man, we got this big advance," and I'm like, "Oh man." But anyway, uh, so that was one of the bad things about being signed around that period.
Yeah.
And the other one was the record deal was really bad because it was right before CDs really hit. So we were based on vinyl sales back then, and it was really not a good deal, but we didn't realize it. I mean, for us, we were thrilled just to be, the whole experience of we went up to New York. Like they sent an A&R guy down to Maryland to see us, and then he's the guy that decided they were going to sign us. So he went back up to New York, and they invited us up there to do a showcase at SIR Studios. So all the executives were there. The president at the time was Doug Morris. He was there, and he's the guy that came up after our set in this rehearsal studio. He comes up and he goes, so boys, how would you like to be on Atlantic? And we were like, like that was like, we finally did it. So yeah, we were thrilled just to be on and Atlantic.
That was a massive label in the day.
Yeah, and you see that logo going around on the turntable. It was just such a cool thing to be on a major label like that. I mean, well, Zeppelin started out on Atlantic, but they ended up with their own label. But well, even AC/DC, they were on Adco, which is part of Atlantic. Everything was, it was just so cool to be on that label.
Yeah.
So we kind of we thought everything was great and we just went on with it. But later on we found out how really bad our record deal really was.
Your record deal, you're probably right. In '83, Cool Kids came out, and the record company had more of a say in the production of that album. Is that right?
Yeah, they were sort of pushing us towards writing singles and that's probably the pattern back then of a record company. They let you go on the first record because those songs you've been playing forever, and then when it comes around to writing new songs for the second record, yeah, they try to, well, you guys need some more singles because I think they released The Itch. That was our only single off the first record. So, and it didn't do anything. The couple of stations played it and that was it. And so yeah, they were trying to convince us to be more commercial, more poppy, and we didn't know any better. So we took their advice thinking that, okay, maybe they'll push us, and so we go in and record that record. And I remember right when we got done, we're doing the final mixes and we were down in Florida at Criteria Studios, which is a cool studio, and our A&R guy comes down for the final mixes just to sit in and listen to what we've done. And we were on a break in the lounge and he goes, "Oh, I want you guys to hear this." And he pulls this cassette out. It was Def Leppard Pyromania. Was that their first? That was their first big rock record.
Yeah, that was out around that time as well. Pyromania. Yep.
Yeah. So he had the final mixes of that. It wasn't released yet, and he puts it in the cassette deck and plays it for us. And we're on our final mixes of this wimpy little commercial poppy record, and he plays Pyromania for us, and it was like, well, we could have done that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It was a strange decision because you look at the music scene back then. Quite right, we're hitting the charts big. You mentioned Pyromania was about to hit the charts, but other bands, up and coming bands like Motley, they were coming out with that huge rock sound.
Well, yeah, and then we were like heavily influenced by AC/DC as well, and
Yeah,
we
and who
could have that
albums
way.
out? Ozzy's first solo albums out at that time as well. So
Yeah,
strange decision.
yeah.
Yeah. But you did return to the classic kick sound in 1985. Midnight Dynamite was released with the lead single, Midnight Dynamite. How was the recording process different? Did you take more ownership back from the record company of your sound?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. After Cool Kids, it was like, we're not doing that again.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are some good songs on Cool Kids. Like,
Cool Kids itself is a great song.
but the only problem with that record was, well, the main complaint that I had with it was the leadoff song. What is it called? I can't even remember. Burning Love, I think.
Yeah.
It's a cover song, and I remember when we learned it, we had to learn it, and I just learned the basics. And I remember thinking, it's just a throwaway song, and there's not even a guitar solo on it or anything. It's like it's got a bunch of keyboard stuff or synthesizer stuff,
Yeah.
and that was the first song on the record, and it was like, oh man, that's like, what a way to start off a record. Like if that was me listening to it, I'd get halfway through that song and I go, next. I wouldn't even have given it a chance. So that sort of killed it right there. So yeah, when Midnight Dynamite came along, it was like we were determined to not just ignore everything and just do what we do best. And and we had Beau Hill producing it, and he had just gotten off the Rat record, so he was definitely a rock producer. He wasn't this so yeah, so that was the purpose, was just to do this rock record. And at the same time, Donnie's songwriting, it was maturing. He was getting way better at it. And as far as the rest of us in the band, Donnie, it was weird. He was nonstop, and for every 10 songs that he would bring to the band, myself personally, I might have one that wasn't even that great. It's like I couldn't keep up. Nobody could keep up with him. So we were always working on his stuff, but his stuff kept getting better and better. So like we didn't mind working on it because it was good. So by Midnight Dynamite, it was kind of like I like to, not to make a comparison, but I'm a huge Stones fan, and for me, when they came out with Beggar's Banquet, I felt like they finally found their sound, and I feel Midnight Dynamite was sort of our Beggar's Banquet. Like we finally found our sound on that record. Not that it's like Beggar's Banquet, it's like up here for me, but that's the way it felt for me personally in the band. Like we were sort of searching on those first two, and then finally, boom, we finally, like, this is what we're supposed to sound like. So
that's a great analogy, because that classic sound was further explored and probably deepened by the time 1988 Blow My Fuse come out.
Mm-hmm.
Blow My Fuse, it's the go-to record for any fan, because from the first track right to the end, it's just full of classic rock songs. What was the approach to this album compared to Midnight Dynamite?
It was basically the same. I mean, from then on, we just sort of got on into this like pattern of just playing and coming back, like having a week off and just going straight back into rehearsals. And we would work on stuff at sound checks. So it was just more of the same kind of thing, except that maybe well, Donnie branched out. He branched out during Midnight Dynamite to write with other people. And he finally found he would use Bob Halligan, he would use Taylor Rhodes, and this guy John Palumbo from Baltimore, this band called Crack the Sky. So those were his three guys, that his go-to guys, and they each had their own style. So Donnie knew which song to present these different guys, and I think from him doing that, it's sort of that also like kind of just refined his songwriting. And so by the time I got to Midnight Dynamite, I mean, Blow My Fuse, yeah, he had almost perfected it in a way. And the other cool thing about Blow My Fuse was we changed managements at that point, because up till that point, it was almost like, I mean, we had really high expectations. Well, every time we put a record out, we did. So by the time Blow My Fuse came around, it was like, we thought we would be further along by then, and we weren't. Like, all these other bands were just coming out and passing us by. And all these bands that in the early 80s that would open for us, they ended up being bigger than us. And like, what are we doing wrong? So we got a new management. We got Mark Puma, who had Twisted Sister at the time. And he actually went in and renegotiated our record deal too at that same point. So he got us a way better deal, and he actually had a plan for the record when it came out. So everything started falling into place for that record, and I think that's why it was so successful. Here's the weird part about that one too. By that point, we were a couple $1 million in debt to the record company, because they had financed the previous records. They hadn't. I'm sure they got their money back, but they always said they didn't. They're like loan sharks. But
Mate, they would have on Blow My Fuse alone, I would have thought.
huh?
They would have got their money back on Blow My Fuse alone, I would have thought.
Oh, they did. They got their money back before that. I know they did. But they did. They give us tour support. But there was a point during Blow My Fuse where we actually got a printout of all the expenses and the income, the spreadsheet. And it was the first time I think we'd ever actually sat down and looked at one of these things. And this was at the point where we were, I can't remember what tour we were on, but after Blow My Fuse is when we finally started getting major tours. Like before that, we'd have a few shows here and there, but we never were on a proper tour bus on a proper tour until Blow My Fuse.
I think you joined the Rat tour, which was your first arena tour at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was the point. That was at that point is when at one point we were on tour, because we had the tour bus, we had the tour manager, we had the full road crew, like all that. And excuse me. And so we looked at the spreadsheet, and we were making really good money back then. And at the top of the page was how much income we'd made like the previous month or so. And then the expenses, and they included road crew, they included our tour manager, the bus payment, the manager, the accountants, all that stuff were on there. And the band was the bottom. It was like this trickle down. So we got to scraps at the bottom. And I remember looking at it and going, wow, my guitar tech makes more than I do. Because at that point, I think we were making like $500 a week or something. And my guitar tech was making $750 a week. Our tour managers were making $1,500 a week. So it was like, what's wrong with this picture? And so we started complaining to our manager about it. And so he was trying to figure out ways to to boost our income somehow. And I remember when he went back to negotiate with Atlantic, he ended up getting the bonus clauses put into the thing. So one of the ones that we were supposed to get was when the record went platinum, we were supposed to get this huge bonus.
Mm.
It would have been a really big payoff. And here's how the record company works. We didn't go platinum until 10 years after the fact. And that's when the cutoff point to our new contract went back to the old contract. And as soon as that happened, we went platinum.
Yeah.
Like up until there, it stalled at like 850, stalled.
Yeah.
So that's how they work. And we never got any of that stuff. But I remember even now I go back and there's a guy that used to book us in Baltimore, and every once in a while he'll post on his page like an old contract of ours will pop up. And we were making, the money we made back then for live shows was really, really good. But it all went into the bank, and then we'd just get our little paycheck, and then we'd end up spending it on production, or all those videos that we made were charged back to us, like all that stuff. So yeah, I don't know. There was a lot of money, and then we never saw it. And when it came time, well, I don't want to jump ahead, but when I finally decided to leave the band, I remember I had enough money to make it maybe 2 weeks, and so I had to get a job straight out of the band because there was no way I was going to survive.
So we're almost talking 10 years into the band, and you walked out with 2 weeks worth of money. That's crazy.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, by the time I left, I think I was in the band 19 years.
Yeah. Okay.
But that includes like the shoes days and all that stuff too.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. The band did finish up at around 95. So 91, Hotwire was released. At this point, you'd moved to LA. You become a paid employee of the band as a part of an integral member. 95, Show Business was released, and then the band parted ways. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, actually, Hotwire, I was still in the band. I didn't leave until after that. So, and that was a bummer because we had the hit with "Don't Close Your Eyes."
Yeah.
Off of "Blow My
Which, if my
Fuse."
research is correct, the record company weren't even going to release that as a single until your management.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we were at the end of the touring cycle. We were on the Tesla Great White Tour, and they're already telling us start thinking about the next record. And I'm sure you probably heard that story, but Alan Niven, Great White's manager, who was also Guns N' Roses manager at the time, he said, how come Atlantic's not releasing that song? And our manager was there that night that he was asking about it. And our manager was like, yeah, well, they say the record's done. They're not going to put any more money into it. And he goes, they'd be crazy. And he goes, you mind if I ask them? So our manager goes, yeah, be my guest. And he did. And within a couple of weeks, they'd released that song, and it just went. So
it hit the charts worldwide, particularly in Japan. It went crazy for the single.
Yeah. So when Hotwire came around, we're like, wow, that now we're on the verge. Like we thought, now that song has been a hit, this record's gonna go and we'll finally be there. And here's another thing. What, like, our whole career was sort of based on bad timing. I think we were 2 weeks out from going in to do Hotwire, and to line up studio time and a producer and all that stuff, it's a process. You have to put it all together. So we had the studio booked. We had Tom Werman lined up again for the Hotwire album, and 2 weeks out, our management gets a call from AC/DC's management. They wanted us to go on tour with them, and that was our dream tour.
Yeah.
And we had to turn it down because we were headed into the studio.
Yeah,
So that was like the ultimate bad timing, because I'm sure if we would have gotten that tour, Hotwire probably would have been way bigger than it was.
yeah,
And the bad part about Hotwire too, another part of the bad timing was right when it was about to be released, Nirvana came out with their first record. So
yep.
it took the wind out of all the hard rock sales, you know.
Yeah, it did put a lot of pressure on hard rock at the time, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, not many bands survived that period.
Yeah, and that's when uh we saw it coming. We you know, everything changed like overnight, it seemed. And then like hair bands, which we were lumped into, like we didn't feel like we were a hair band, but we were stuck in that category. But hair
Yeah,
bands became like a joke, you know, it wasn't cool anymore. And that's when I decided to leave, because it was just like, you know, it was so discouraging. It was like I could see it. It was like a sinking ship, and I didn't want to go down with the ship, so I
yeah,
just bailed.
yeah.
And the week I left was the week they released that last. It was kind of like to fulfill our contract. They released the Kicks live record,
Yeah, yeah.
and that's the week I left. And it's weird because I'm on the cover. That's a picture of my hands and my guitar on the cover of that live record, and I was no longer in the band when that came out.
Wow. There you go. That's a tough story to hear with, bad timing and so forth.
Yeah,
You
but I mean that it's weird, you know. If it had gone another way, who knows what would happen though, you know. It's like I can't really, you know, it's just the way that it had to happen. So it is the way it happened. And you know, I wouldn't be where I am today either if it wouldn't have been for all that stuff, you know.
The universe works in some strange ways sometimes, though.
Right.
So, Brian, at this time, you're out of LA, you're living there, and you start collaborating with a guy that we all know, Eric Stacey from Faster Pussycat.
Hmm.
How did that collaboration come along, and what happened with the Rhythm Slaves? I think you called yourselves at that time.
Well, I actually hooked up with him before I even quit the band. It
Yeah.
was like the previous fall and winter. uh I was looking to leave, and I was looking for something else to do. And the funny thing is, well, my guitar tech went on to do the Faster Pussycat tour.
Yeah.
And so I called up my guitar tech Randy, because I was trying to get a hold of Tammy, because I wanted to collaborate with Tammy
Yeah.
on songs. And it just so happened that my guitar tech Randy was sharing a room with Eric. And Eric goes, I guess Randy told him that I was on the phone, and he goes, "Oh, let me talk to him. Let me talk to him." So Eric gets on there. So I ended up with Eric instead of Tammy.
Yeah.
Um, and so Eric ended up coming to my house in Hagerstown and spending a week. And we wrote a like just collection of songs together. And I had so many frequent flyer miles at that point from going to Japan a couple of times. And uh, I started flying out to LA like once a month or so.
Okay.
When the band had a few days, I would go out there and get together with Eric and Pat Muzingo from Junkyard was the drummer. Um, else we have at that point? Oh, yeah, this little French guy named Francois on guitar, really good guitar player. Um,
Awesome.
but we started rehearsing, and I remember we finally found this singer. Uh, his proper name is Adam White, but his nickname was Rail. I don't know why, but really good kind of Black Crowes, like Chris Robinson vibe. But he also sounded like a little bit like Paul Rogers. He had that Paul Rogers thing, really bluesy, really good singer. So we did this 4-song demo in February of 93. And I remember when we mixed it down, and when I heard it back, I was like, that's when I knew I was going to leave Kicks. Like I already knew I wanted to leave Kicks, but that solidified it. It was like, okay, this is good. This is worth leaving the band for.
Yeah.
So that's what I remember, taking that tape back home, and the first person I played it for was Steve, and I was holding all this in up until that point, and I finally played that for him and told him, I'm leaving, and he didn't blame me, and I remember it was a big weight off my shoulders to finally get that out, and needless to say, though, I get out to LA, and the Rhythm Slave starts playing around, and nothing came of that. But it got me out of the band, and it got me into a different direction there for a while. So, and after that's when I went back and did the show business record. So I was already in LA playing with those guys when I came back and did that record.
Yeah. So 95, Kicks released Show Business. What happened after that?
I don't know if they were hoping I'd come back or not, but there was no way. And they paid me as an outside guy.
You were a hired gun for this album, right?
Yeah, and so I was paid what I should have been paid all along, and I was the only one that got paid. So it was
great choice.
Yeah, and I remember they did talk me into doing three shows.
Yep.
After the record was released. I went back and did 3 shows with them, and then that was it. But the funny thing was, when I did that, our singer and the Rhythm Slaves, well, at that point we had already separated from Eric. We got a different bass player, and so we changed our name to Catfish. And while I was back home doing the Kicks gigs, Rail calls me and informs me that he's quitting because he thought that I was going to go back with Kicks.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to do the bluesy Black Crowes thing. Like, he hated being compared to Chris Robinson. I don't know why, but he wanted to, at that point, the whole alternative movement was there. Like grunge, I don't know, grunge was the beginning of the 90s, and then mid-90s, it was sort of like this alternative kind of sound. And he wanted to do that. And I remember thinking, why? Because I remember he played a few songs that he had, and it was like, you're wasting your voice on that stuff. But that's what he wanted to do. So that was the end of that band.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, we talk about the highs of the music industry, but unfortunately, there's also some pretty dark times as well. You went through those dark times around 97, 98. I think it's well done. How did you pull yourself out of that?
Well, it was a long process getting into it too, because I mean, all through the 80s, well, here's the thing about Kicks, we were highly professional. Like we had set band rules, like you couldn't drink before a show or during a show.
Yeah.
So, or do drugs until after the show.
Yeah.
So that was my pattern, like all through the 80s. After the show, all bets were off, but before and during, we'd all just be spot on, just professional. And that kind of I think that kept me in line for the 80s, from going off the rails. And but I was I drank a lot back then, because back then the hangovers weren't as bad when you're in your 20s and early 30s.
No, they get worse.
But they get worse and worse. Yeah. And I was big into cocaine, and the 80s, and every town that we went to, I had a coke dealer waiting for me. And I'd be on stage, and I'd look out in the audience, I'd see my guy, and then I'd look down at the set list, and I started counting songs. All right, 5 more songs. It's like, I was starting to get preoccupied with that kind of stuff even back then. and at the end of right before the Rat Tour, both Ronnie and I, we had our my problems weren't as far as advanced as his at that point. So he had to go off to rehab. And I remember at that somewhere along there at those around that time, I started feeling like I was having a problem as well.
Yeah.
And I remember I stopped just on my own, cold turkey at that point. And then Ronnie comes back from rehab and we roomed together. So I didn't drink or do drugs the whole rest of the time I was in Kicks until I got out to LA. And then because I didn't do anything about it, I just stopped on my own. I didn't realize that you can't just go back to it and it'd be like a reset. It's like, no, if you go back to it, you're already where you were when you left off. And that's what happened. During the, like I was out in LA for maybe a year, and then I decided it would be a good thing, a good idea to start drinking again. I said, and I thought, well, as long as I don't do coke, I'll be okay.
Mm.
Well, it didn't take long before that went out the window and I was doing coke again. And then
Wow.
I was just around it. There was a lot of drugs in LA at that point in
Yeah.
the mid 90s. And I remember I started questioning myself as like, am I really addicted to this, or I just like to do it? Like, it's hard to tell if you're addicted to something. So I decided, and this was like this classic like addict experiment. I decided to try doing heroin to see if I would feel the withdrawals if I stopped. So I started doing that. Like it's just craziness in my mind. I was my full blown like disease was happening at that point, and so all my decisions were just like, like stupid. So I was drinking, I was doing coke, and I started doing heroin. And I remember I did it a month straight. Oh, I found a guy, a connection, and he was a harmonica player in this blues band. And just so happened that their guitar player was a crackhead and ended up just disappearing on him. So they needed a guitar player. So I was like, oh, so I joined them so I could be next to the heroin dealer guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was my supply chain. And so I did that. I did it straight for a month, and then I stopped. And sure enough, I felt it. And I go, oh, wow. So that's what it feels like. But even then, in my mind, I mean, I didn't know anything about addiction. I didn't know anything about alcoholism. I didn't know anything. And I didn't understand that just because cocaine, you don't really feel a physical withdrawal from it. You're still addicted to it.
Mm.
And I ended up, well, I was still friends with our singer from Rhythm Slaves, that guy Rayo, and he would drop by just to visit every once in a while, and we'd jam on some song ideas. He came by my house one night with a handful of crack and taught me how to smoke crack. And oh man, it was downhill from there. I had like the heroin as a foundation to keep me well. And then I was smoking crack on top of it for thrills. And it got worse and worse and worse and worse. It just progressed. And looking back at my history, thank God we never got huge in the 80s, because if I would have had like Motley Crue money, I would have killed myself. So it's a good thing I didn't have any money, because I had barely enough to buy enough drugs to just get by, not enough to kill myself. So, but I got to where nothing mattered anymore. It was like, I was still working. I was working for my brother, painting billboards. And then it even got to the point where he couldn't even keep me. He had to he lay me off, but I was fired because I was just I was so unreliable at that point, and I was pawning all my stuff. I was down to just my Telecaster, and
Oh,
all my other guitars were in the pawn shop, including my grandfather's acoustic. Um, so I ended up in jail. I started getting arrested. I get pulled over and in bad neighborhoods, and I got arrested a couple times, and then I ended up in LA County Jail, and they were going to keep me there for how long was it? I think 120 or 150 days or something. I was supposed to be in there, and luckily a friend of mine was there was this thing called a musicians assistance program, which is it merged with Music Cares, and Music Cares is they're who put on the Grammys and all that stuff.
okay.
So they would help musicians go into rehab, and a friend of my girlfriend's recommended them to her, so she called them, and they sent a lawyer out to the jail to talk to me, and he goes, if I can arrange it, would you agree to go, if I can get you out of here, to go to rehab? And I said, yeah, but I wasn't thinking, to get clean. I was thinking to get out of jail.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. He got me out of jail. I was in there for around 2 weeks, 15 days maybe, which is not too bad, but just enough to have it sink in, and to get me off the drugs, actually. I through the whole withdrawal in jail, and then my mind cleared up, and one day I'm walking, I'm in the jail suit and in a line, and I remember thinking, just having flashbacks to the 80s of being, the rock star guy.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and I'm, here I am in jail, and I'm like, what happened? Like, how did I end up here? Like, that had that clarity, that moment of clarity. So, I mean, all those little things sort of lined up for me. So when I finally did get out of jail, I went to court. They said, okay, we'll let you go to rehab, but it doesn't count against your sentence. So when you're done with that, you're going to have to come back to jail. So I went to rehab, and I just had my fingers crossed that things would work out. And it's so funny because I got out of jail, and the whole process, like everything about jail, is they torture you in there. Like, they don't make it fun. There's no fun at all. And even the process of checking out of jail is no fun. And it was like grueling. Like, they put you in a holding tank with a bunch of other scummy people, and you have to sit there and wait, and you hear the guards' keys jingling down the thing, and they bring a rack of clothes, and then they open the door and they call certain names, but you're sitting there and they don't call your name, so you sit there another couple hours. It's just like this whole thing. And then when I finally got out of there, it was almost like I got to that rehab, and I'm like, I don't want to go back to that jail. It's like, there's no way I want to go through that ever again. So it gave me this little shift in my thinking, where it's almost like when I walked through that rehab door, I just became willing to do whatever it took to not return to where I just came from. And it was enough to open my mind, and I did everything I could to make things work out, and they did. I remember I was in that rehab for 60 days, and then I had to go to a sober living house. And I remember the second day I was at the sober living was my follow-up court date, where they were going to either let me stay there or go back to jail. And I remember showing up at court, and my lawyer was all like, he was all nervous, and he was like, he goes, I hate to tell you this, but it's not looking good. And the funny thing was, at that point in my recovery, I was kind of okay with it. It's like, well, if that's the way it's gonna be, I just have to accept it and do what I have to do. And the judge, he sentenced me back to 90 days. And my lawyer, he goes, excuse me, Your Honor, can I speak with you in private? And they went back.
Oh,
And then the judge comes back out and he goes, you're sentenced to Liberty House for 60 days. That's the sober living where I was living.
Yep.
So he sentenced me there for 60 days instead of jail for 90 days. I'm like, thank you. It was like, but for some reason, I kind of had the faith that it was going to work out, and it did. And I ended up staying at that sober living for another year. So,
nice.
you know, like rehab and sober living, I stayed in recovery for a whole 14 months, but it was enough to. I just remember when I was in the rehab, it was kind of a big place. It's the same place Chuck Negron went from Three Dog Night. He went through that same place, but there were probably 105 people in there, and I remember they had this big group where there was all these people in the room, and the counselor was up there talking, and he goes, you know, out of all you people here, he goes, there's only going to be like 3 of you that are going to make it. And I remember, yeah, it's a crazy number, but it's true. And I remember hearing that, and I thought, I'm going to be one of those 3.
That's awesome.
So that was my determination, and I was. So I mean, there might have been 3 or 4 maybe, but there's a few that I still know from there that did stay sober, but there's so many. There's so many that are dead now.
That's sad. That's sad.
Yeah.
Brian, look, thanks for sharing that. That's harrowing, but inspirational as well. And I'm really glad that you're one of the 3, because you went on to some pretty cool things after that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's weird. It's weird though. Even when I was doing the drugs, I was in the blues band. I was in this other country rock band, and I was playing with. That's when my relationship with Reeve from Rhino Bucket was in the blues band. So that's where I met Reeve. And then, well, I actually met those guys back in the 80s too, because we did some shows with them. But George came along before I got sober, and we put this thing together before I even got sober called Deep Six Holiday, which was me, George, Reeve, and a different drummer. And then I went to jail, and that whole thing fell apart. So Rhino Bucket comes along right after I got out of the sober living. Ricky Rackman was trying to resurrect the Cat House thing, and he asked George if Rhino Bucket could play, and so George asked me, because their original guy Greg didn't want to do it. So I said, yeah, I'll learn the songs. So I learned the songs, did the gig, and then we got another gig, and then another gig, and then we got this movie soundtrack, and we started writing new songs. And I like to equate it to like when you meet a new girl and you start hanging out and you go on a few dates, and then before you know it, that's your girlfriend. And like, how'd that happen? That's kind of how Rhino Bucket happened. It's like all of a sudden I'm in the band. It's like, how did this happen? I wasn't even planning on that, but it turned out to be a cool thing, because I love playing with those guys. And it's, it's similar to Kicks with the energy, but it's more stripped down, and there's like
a completely different style, isn't it? And one which Australian fans, they've really warmed to Rhino Bucket since their debut CD way back. But
with they're highly influenced by AC/DC. So, and I have no problem with that.
No, you know what to expect, right?
Yeah.
But looking from the outside in, you seem to have really formed an integral part with Rhino Bucket. You know, every song, it just seems to be a tight unit, which is full of collaboration. You're credited with all of the songwriting on there, as are the other band members. Is it much different being in a band like Rhino Bucket, where there's, you know, that tight feeling versus the other bands that you've played in?
Yeah, I mean, Kicks, you know, back in our heyday, you know, we had Donnie, who was the
Yeah,
leader
yeah,
and the main songwriter. So we didn't have as much say in stuff. Like he was the guy. Um, you know, really, real early on in Kicks, we would collaborate more as a band, but the further along it went, and the more Donnie started working with outside songwriters, it became like he'd bring a full demo to us, and we'd
mm,
have to learn the song,
mm,
and then we, you know, I might have the freedom. Well, I had, you know, I could do my own guitar solo, and I had also had the freedom to maybe add a second guitar part to a verse or something. But that's about as far as that went. But with Rhino Bucket, it's always been as you know, since I've been there, uh, it's always been full collaboration. You know, it'd be
mm.
somebody's initial idea, but when we got together, we'd all like contribute to it, to the final product. So that's kind of how that's been going with them.
Yeah,
And it's a lot more, yeah, it's a, there's a freedom there because nobody's telling me what to play. Like, I mean, George can suggest something, like he might go, "Oh, it'd be cool if you know there's
what about
something."
this? Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
I'm totally open to that because you know if it's something didn't think of, it'd be like, "Oh, okay, I didn't think of that."
yeah.
Uh, but it really I like that way of working, you know, where you don't, you're not really, like, I felt stifled with Donnie with his stuff.
Mm.
I didn't really get to do what I do. And with Rhino Bucket, and it's almost like a better fit music wise with Rhino Bucket with my style. Um, Kicks, I sort of have to sort of mold it to that sound a little bit more. I mean, you know, my style does come through, but it's not as easy
No,
as Rhino.
yeah, yeah. Mate, just moving back to Kicks in 2003, most of the band reformed,
Mhm.
uh, played a few gigs. What was the feeling like being back with the old gang? Unfortunately, Donnie wasn't part of that, but the rest of you?
Yeah, that was funny because well, Steve had this band called Funny Money at the time
Yeah.
that he put together right after Kicks broke up, and they would do Kick songs in that band, and at one point, Ronnie's band, the Blues Vultures, were opening for Funny Money. They do gigs together, and Ronnie would get up at the end of the night with Funny Money. So it was Steve, Ronnie, and then Jimmy on drums, and they do the Kick songs, and people would go crazy. So that when that started happening, Steve called me up and he goes, "Hey, you know, it'd be really cool if you'd come into town and do this, just a surprise jump up there with Ronnie and Jimmy and myself." He said that we could get a bonus from the promoter and you could get paid for it. And I thought, yeah, that'd be cool. And we tried to work it out, and it didn't work out that way, but it got us talking. So we finally decided to put together some shows. And it was the holidays around December of 2003. And I remember at that time we didn't even know who owned the name. Like we didn't know if we were allowed to use it or any of that stuff. So I remember those first, it was maybe four shows I think we did first. We called ourselves 4 out of 5 Kicks or 4/5 of Kicks or something like that. That's how we advertised it. So it wasn't like full on just Kicks. And but those shows were such a success. It was like, well, we got to do this again. So we booked the following fall. And in that time period, we got Mark Shanker to play bass. Well, the reason I got to go back to this. When Steve talked about putting the band back together, he goes, the only thing I got to say is, I can't work with Donnie, so we have, if we do it, Donnie can't be in the band. And I remember saying, well, I don't want to work with Donnie either. Like nobody wanted to. And then we find out Jimmy says the same thing, Ronnie says the same thing, and because we were just tortured by him all those years. I mean, he's a great songwriter, and when you're not working with him, he was a nice guy. But when you had to work with him, when it came down to working, he cracked a whip. It was no fun. So anyway, that's why we didn't do it with him. So between those first set of shows and the second set, Mark Shanker took it upon himself to research the name and found out nobody owned the name. It was just out there.
Perfect. Yeah.
So we got the name to make sure that nothing would go wrong. And we could sell the merch and all that stuff. So
awesome. Great move, because in 2014, Kix released Rock Your Face Off, which charted probably just as high on the American charts as Blow My Fuse. That was, probably the comeback album of the year back then.
Yeah, what is weird in this new like music climate, it's like it's hard to judge how well a record does because it's not the same as it used to be. No. You don't really go record sales anymore like you used to, but that it took a long time for us to come around to that record too. If you realize from 2003
to 2014, there's a lot of time there.
But it was a kind of a long, slow build, because we did it a few years in a row where it was just the Christmas holidays and then the September run. So there'd be 2 chunks of shows a year. And then I remember Steve was booking the band at the time, and then he was starting to get overwhelmed with having to deal with the business and performing. So I suggested finding a booking agent, and I started researching that, and that's when we found our guy Sullivan Big, who books us now. And he's the guy that got us out of, because we were just doing local shows around Baltimore and Maryland and that area. And he's the guy that got us out and, nationwide again. And it just took off from there. And every time we do an interview, they'd always ask us about a new record. And we were like, we had relied so heavily on Donnie all those years. We were terrified of the thought of having to do it ourselves. And we just kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off.
Yeah, okay. But you were also writing for Rhino Bucket at this time as well. So you must have been somewhat comfortable with, having a go.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe
not.
Personally, I didn't really have the confidence. But the way that came around was we at one point we had these friends of ours that were into filmmaking, and they would come around and shoot our show, some live stuff, and it looked really good. So Mark asked them if they'd be willing to do a full-blown Kix concert, a live show. So they came down to Ram's Head in Baltimore and shot this live concert.
Yeah.
And when it was done, it turned out so well that Mark took it upon himself to try to shop that to see if we could get it picked up. And we got it picked up by Frontiers Records over in Italy, who have a bunch of the old 80s bands on their label. So they agreed to release that live thing for us if we agreed to do a studio record.
Studio album, yeah.
So we said, okay. So they released the live DVD. And soon after that, and so that got us thinking about putting songs together. So soon after that, Loud and Proud Records came around, and we'd known this guy, Tom Lipsky, the guy that ran Loud and Proud, from show business, because that's the label, we were on his label for that record. And then Mark Schenker also worked with him on one of his bands. And we had just signed with Frontiers, and then Loud and Proud pops up, and we're like, oh man, we should have gone with that label, because it was an American label. And luckily Frontiers messed up with the live DVD. They didn't clear the licensing for the songs, because when it's a DVD, it's considered a movie soundtrack when it's a live. So you have to get clearance from the public for the publishing and all that stuff. And they didn't do it. So 30 days into it, they had to pull the CD back out. They had to just pull it off the shelves. But it was perfect for us, because that gave us a reason to get out of our contract, because they messed up. So we got out of that contract and signed with Loud and Proud, and that worked out for us. So at that point, it started with me and Mark got together first, because he had a demo with a bunch of songs that he had co-written with an old bandmate of his. Steve had a bunch of songs. I actually didn't have anything that would fit Kicks, except for one Rhino Bucket song that didn't make it on a Rhino Bucket record. So that's the one I brought to Kicks, which ended up the title track for the record. But all those other songs, like the ones that Mark brought, were really good. But the guy that he wrote with was a really heavily influenced by like Eddie Van Halen. So it was like a really kind of almost a LA sounding thing. And so Mark and I worked together, and I tried to help tear these songs apart and try to make them more Kicks, like, because they didn't sound like Kicks at first, but they ended up working out. And I remember when we got the first few together, then we started talking about getting somebody to produce it. And I suggested Taylor Rhodes, which is one of Donnie's old songwriting partners. Plus he produced Hotwire. It was supposed to be co-produced with Tom Werman, but Tom got fired halfway through, so Taylor took over.
Yep.
And I said, he'd be perfect, because he's familiar with the Kicks sound, and he could take all these songs and make them into a Kicks. So that was the plan, and it worked. So I remember when we did that record, it was a lot of work trying to get it just to keep it on track as a Kicks record. But when it came out, I remember listening to it, and I was blown away by how well it turned out without Donnie, because I couldn't see it happening going into it, but it worked out.
Right, it's a classic case of backing yourself and believing in yourself, right? Because it was a great album. Dirty Girls, fantastic Kicks track, I will say that. And Love Me With Your Top Down. You couldn't get more Kicks than those two songs.
Yeah, Love Me With Your Top Down. We do that. That's, for some reason, that got into the set. We've done a bunch of them, but that one just has stuck into the set. But I think it's because Steve has this whole thing he does before the song where he interacts with the crowd and stuff and gets them to sing. And
Brian, it's been a wonderful career today. The comeback album, Rock Your Face Off. You've recorded 4 albums with Rhino Bucket. You're doing double duty in both bands. What's next in the life of Brian Forsythe?
Well, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing as long as I can until the wheels fall off. But, Kicks is, we're booked up through next year.
Wow.
Rhino Bucket, we're currently getting songs together. We're going to do another record.
Oh, great. When can we see that record?
That part of it, I'm not sure, because we always have these big plans like, oh, we'll record it during this time and we'll have it out before the end of the year. But I don't think that's going to happen. So probably early next year or so it'll get done. But we're going to Europe in January, and then Rhino Bucket is
Rhino
also,
Bucket?
yeah. Yeah, that's usually the January is a kind of a sparse time for kicks gigs. So that's usually when I'll go off with Rhino Bucket and go do some stuff. And which is kind of sad because when I first started the Rhino Bucket, kicks wasn't happening yet. So I had all this time for them. And then kicks comes back around and I've just had to keep, the time I can spend with Rhino Bucket has been getting smaller and smaller, which is, you know, it's not fair to them. But in fact, after that last Rhino Bucket record, we did it was called the last real rock and roll. Eddie Spaghetti from Super Suckers produced that one.
Yeah.
We did a European tour and then we did the cruise. And then I remember nothing really happened with that record. Again, as with most of the Rhino Bucket records, kind of came and went. And George was so discouraged that he decided he was just going to go get a real job, and that was it. And we didn't play again for like 4 years. There was like this hiatus, and then I knew he'd eventually get bored, so he eventually started calling me again, and now it's starting back up. So
Good. That's good. How about kicks? What's next for kicks?
we're just playing. I mean, I'm playing this coming weekend and on after and after and after. We're not playing in January because I'll be in Europe, but
Yeah.
beyond that, we're booked and we're playing the Monsters of Rock cruise this coming next year, early next year.
Awesome.
Like,
Awesome. That's not far away at all.
yeah.
Brian, it's been an absolute fantastic conversation. You've lived just an amazing life. You've fought through the tough times and you're just still rocking it, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure. One final question. If there's any advice
Okay.
you give to an aspiring musician, what would that advice
Yeah.
be?
Yes. I would say, if it's in your heart, never give up. I mean, there were times when it crossed my mind, um, and I didn't give up. I just kept going, and I just even when I was struggling, I would, because it's what I want to do. And there was a point like early on in my early band years where I was terrible. Like I hadn't figured it out yet, and I remember that didn't stop me. Like I just I refuse to give up. And that's really the key. Don't give up and be true to yourself. Don't follow the trends. Like I that's another thing I try not to do. I try to just to play what I enjoy and just hope everybody else sort of jumps on board with it.
That is very similar advice to everyone else. Believe in yourself and never give up. Beautiful words, Brian. And what better way to finish the interview? Brian, on behalf of the Rock House, that's just an amazing story. I do thank you for your time, your honesty, and wonderful insight to all of your career to date.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And one of these days, I've got to make it to Australia. That's on my bucket list.
Your fans are going to hold you to that, mate. Whether it's with Rhino Bucket or Kicks, we demand you come down.
Oh, I would love it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks again, Brian. On behalf of the Rock House, keep rocking, mate.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks, mate.